Okay, so I just have to do this really quick video describing something that really annoys me when I see people scripting within Second Life and some programmers externally who are especially new to the world of programming and scripting. Okay, and that is the complete and utter ignorance of the else-if statement. Let me demonstrate. So if I make a new script here, right, and let's just say you have a simple if statement, I don't know, say you have a string and you have a word in that string, like the word test, right, and you're going, if example equals test, then say to the owner, test. I don't know. Now, what you're supposed to do, if you want to add another condition to that, right, you're supposed to go else if, example equals cat, and then allow owner say cat, right? And then if you want to do an else at the end, you can, although it's not necessary because we haven't got any extra code after this. But if we had other code that we ran after that if statement, then the else would be necessary if you wanted to run code that didn't meet those conditionals. Okay, but if we don't have any other code or we don't need an else, then we can obviously delete that. But people seem to miss out the else word on an else if conditional. Okay, now if I run that now, we should get test outputted. And we do. Then if I change the word to cat, obviously it should succeed at this part and say cat. Yep. Now, some programmers will completely miss out the if like that. Now, this will still work, okay? This will still function. And I can prove that if I just run the code now. Cat. And if I change that to test, it should say test. Test. Now, the reason this is a problem, the reason why I don't like this is not only does it look, in my opinion, ugly, because you've got an if and then an if, but they're working on the same variable with different data, right? Now that's ugly because that block is saying, okay, so if the example is test, then do this. If the example is cat, then do this. But it doesn't make sense, because in English you'd say, if the example is test, do this, or in this case, else, if the example is cat, do this. Okay? So because you haven't got the else there, the runtime is going to go, okay, if example test, run the owner say, then it's going to do another check. It's going to go, if example cat, well, no, it's not, and it'll skip it. So you're forcing the runtime to do this extra check here on this variable that we've already checked. We've already done it. We know example equals test because that's successfully ran. So why should the runtime then have to do this if check here on the variable when we've already done it? We don't need to. And that's what the beauty of the else statement does, you see. Because effectively what this does is a compiler will optimize that now so that if the variable equals test, it will jump to a statement and completely miss out this whole check because it doesn't need to do it. Okay, so the runtime will never need to do that check because of the word else. But if you move the word else, the runtime is going to do both checks because it doesn't know that this statement should only be ran if the first one doesn't. And a lot of scripters make this mistake. The only time you don't need to use else is if this conditional is completely different. Okay, so if we had another variable, I don't know, example 2, and just give it a random number. Okay, if this check is example 2 equals 572, well now we can't put else. Well, we can put else, but only if that variable needs to be checked if that one fails. Yeah? Let me run this code, you'll see what I mean. So when I run this, it should do both. It should say test and cat. Yeah. So the runtime's gone, okay, if example test, yep. Okay, if example 2 is faster than 2, yep. See what I mean? There's no else to say don't do it, so it's doing both of them. If we put else there, however, it begins to change. Now there's an else there, the second if doesn't get checked, so we don't see cat. So what this is saying is, if the first variable, example, is equal to test, then do this. But if it isn't, then check if example 2 is equal to 572. But the first one is, we don't need to check example 2. Okay? So the rule of law here is, which is what you should be learning in 101 scripting really, else is important if you don't want it to be ran if the first succeeds or the previous one succeeds, but omit it if you do want both of them to be checked at all times. Okay? And the same goes for else. Else is good if those two fail, then obviously the last block is going to be ran. But you really must start. People really should understand this. I've seen a lot of code where they do this, where they use the same variable for the check multiple times, and they just keep doing it. I've seen blocks like this where it's just constant ifs, and even worse. And I can't understand this at all. But people will go return after each block. And they'll just keep doing that over and over again. And I apparently can't type. And yeah, you know what? This is working. This will do what you want. So if I do test 2, then that's test 2. If I do the dog, then that gives dog. And the mouse, then that gives mouse. This will now probably work if I get rid of that variable because I don't need it anymore. Yeah, it gives test and doesn't run the other checks. And if I do... but the only problem with this is, of course, that means now we're using return. All this code after this won't run. So if I do, I want to say here, doesn't really matter. It won't ever execute that code. This is why I don't like this, because what happens if later on you change the script and you want to add stuff after these conditionals? Well, then you've got to remove all of these returns, then you're going to add else's. It's all about good coding standards. It's all about making it so that, number one, it's easy for you to modify. Number two, it's easy for everybody else to read. Even if no one else is going to read it, it's good for you, because then later on, if you come back to a year-old script and you want to know what it does, you want to be able to parse it correctly in your own head. And number three, you're making sure the runtime doesn't do all this extra work. Because whether you realise it or not, without those return statements, it would keep going for all of these ifs. That return statement is blocking that from happening, yes, but it's also meaning any code after it isn't going to run. So if you ever add any extra code to that, it ain't going to work. You're going to have to change, you're going to have to refactor your code just to get that to work. This is bad coding standards. Stop doing it. Okay? The only time you should use return like this, and this is when I normally use it, is if you're using a negative if statement to do a quick check to say, right, hang on a second, before we run this code, let me just do one check to see if it applies to this situation. A good example of this is, say this was a touch event, and before we do any touch stuff, okay, say I want to make sure the owner is the one who's clicking it, then obviously you would do a quick check to see if the detected key equals hello get owner. But if that was the case, we'd have to wrap all our code in this block. So it's much quicker to put that to a not equals, that's a negative check now, and then return if that's the case. I normally get rid, if I've got one line here, I normally get rid of these, and then to there. Just looks neater. But that's the best use, I think, for an if return. It's if you're checking negatives. That just disables this code if it isn't me, it isn't the owner. But that's the only time I really know of doing it that way. So please, guys, make sure you're checking this before you submit that code or you finalize that code. Make sure you're making sure that your code is using to acceptable standards, and make sure you don't have to refactor it so much in the future. It's very important, and you should be learning this at the very beginning when you're scripting.